The Grim in the Grave DLC has just arrived, and you may be curious as to what the hell you get in that DLC. So in this video, I'm going to go through all the new units added to the rosters of the Empire and the Vampire accounts. We're purely looking at the new units in this video, not really looking at any of the campaign stuff, so if that's what you're expecting, you're not going to find it here. So let us begin. So let's start with the Empire. This is all of the new units right here, bar one, which is the Arch-Lector, because I obviously can't put two generals up there at once. We'll get to all them in a sec though, but first there's a few things to note before we begin. So you may have noticed that at the bottom of the unit cards, the little symbol is highlighted in purple on some of these units. What this means is you're only allowed to bring one of them, so they have a cap on them. You can only bring one of each of these units per army. And you can see that in the selection screen they've been greyed out, so now I can't click them anymore. No more. I think this is a good thing personally. It allows you to kind of accent your army rather than building an army of all these fancy units. And the other thing about this DLC is that a lot of the new units are just old units who have been reskinned and buffed up a bit. That's it, and they've been maybe given a few traits. Like these Sigmar's Sons, they're exactly the same as the regular Empire Swordsman, except you can see the stats are slightly buffed. There's a nice green arrow to indicate how much more now, which is a nice touch. And they also have a different trait. They have Unbreakable. So you'll notice that with most of these units, they're very much the same as their old ones, just slightly better and with an extra trait or two. Now let's begin with Volkmar the Grim. He has a hammer infantry. He's kind of half caster, half melee. He's got magical attack and flaming attacks, so he's going to be great against those regenerating lords and units. His weapon strength is okay, mostly non-armor piercing. He's got a little bit more health than Karl Franz, but as a melee one-on-one attacker, he has nothing on Karl Franz, so Karl Franz is probably still the man, I think, on this one, but if you want to have a more supportive general, then Volkmar is probably going to have the advantages because he has quite a lot of spells that are mostly buffs to your units. So things like damage resistance, melee attack, all the typical battle prayers. So a great supporting general. Do have to be careful with him in melee, I think, though, because he doesn't have a lot of armor and he could be a little bit susceptible. His melee defense is pretty good, though. He does have the War Altar of Sigmar, which is this massive structure. You've probably seen it in any of the videos that they've been putting out for this. And it will give him some stat buffs. It will give him more armor, more speed, a few other little bits. It causes terror and it's unbreakable, which is pretty cool. And it has a charge bonus. So it is by all means a chariot. But to be honest, it's huge. So I think it's going to be very susceptible to missiles, but we'll have to see. Next up, we have the Arch-Lector, who is another lord that you can have. He's a hammer infantry, battle prayers and armored. He's very similar to the warrior priest. Just maybe not quite as good in some ways, but better in other ways. He has more armor than the warrior priest. And he has all the battle prayers, so very similar to Volkmar. He has nothing on Karl Franz, but a pretty good hybrid general either way. So he's got some casting abilities, he's got some melee abilities. Another well-rounded support lord, I'd say. So the first infantry unit is the one I mentioned earlier, the Sigmar's Sons. They're a swordsman unit with, as you saw, slightly increased stats, and they are unbreakable. This is a pretty cool thing for them to be unbreakable. They'll be great for buying you time if you need a certain area of your army to hold. You could throw these boys over there and they'll stand there fighting till the last man, and they could buy you that extra time that you need for some kind of strategic advantage. Now we have a completely new unit in the Flagellants. They are a mace infantry, which is pretty cool. That's a new thing. They are unbreakable, damage dealer, frenzy. They're very similar. They remind me of Forsaken on the Chaos Warriors. Maybe not quite as good. They don't have any armor. They're lacking the armor. They're quite fast on their feet though, so they're going to be great for chasing after things. Could be really good for flanking. Their melee attack is okay, not completely terrible. Their melee defense is terrible, however, which leads me to believe that this is a unit that's meant to be used kind of like a shock cavalry. You charge it in and then you pull it away. Their weapon strength is also pretty good, and they do have a charge bonus, which is pretty good for an infantry. So again, that leads me to believe shock cavalry style, charge them in and pull them away. These type of units have always been in Total War games. They're great on charges and great on the initial contact, but then you need to get them out of the battle because they won't survive very long. They've got no melee defense and no armor. That's just a terrible combination. But there are ways to use them which can make them very effective. Then we have the Tattersouls, who are a Flagellant unit, so basically the same as the Flagellant unit, mace infantry, damage dealer, frenzy, unbreakable. Their stats are just slightly better. If we compare them, you can see they've got more health, bit better on the melee attack and the melee defense. Their charge bonus is even better, so they're going to be useful in the same way as the regular Flagellant unit, just a little bit better in certain areas. Now the first in the ranged category, although this unit is classed as a close quarters infantry, the Free Company Militia are an infantry that is also a ranged unit, which is pretty cool. So they got pistols, so they don't have the greatest of ranges, and they are of the regular damage variety, so no armor piercing. But their big thing is that while they are a ranged unit and can do some range damage, they're mainly a melee unit. If you look at their stats, they're up there with kind of the regular swordsman. They could hang in terms of that. They got some charge bonus on them, good melee attack, good speed. Could be an interesting flanking unit if you go around the back of the enemy, blast them in the back a bit and then charge them, pull back, blast them in the back a bit more. Some options with them there, so it could be a very interesting unit. Then we have Stirland's Revenge, who are the fancy version of the Free Company Militia. Very much the same, except the added bonus of Vanguard deployment and stalk, so it means they could hide invisible while moving across terrain, and they're also armor piercing. Other than that, they're just a bit stronger in their melee stats, so they're going to be really good against heavily armoured factions, and they can also stand in a bit of a fight themselves. Then we have the Silver Bullets, who are a handgunner unit, armor piercing of course, and they have stalk, so they can hide while they're moving. Comparing them to the regular handgunner units, you can see the stats are quite a bit increased. They've got magical damage on their ammunition though, which is quite a cool feature. Their melee attack and melee defense is better, so they can hang in melee for a little bit, so that's a little bit different for them as well. So going to be used really the same as regular handgunners, except maybe you want to aim them for wraiths and other units that take magical damage a lot. But for the most part, they're just handgunners. Now for the first cavalry, we have the Knights of the Blazing Sun. Their build is kind of a completely new unit, but really they're just kind of Empire Knights who are slightly buffed. If you look at the stats, you can see they're very similar to Empire Knights, just slightly better in a lot of areas. But the big thing about them is that their melee attacks are fire damage, so they're going to be great against those regenerating units of the vampires. The extra damage they do to those units could be really devastating. And they do have a pretty big charge bonus as well, so they are very much a shock cavalry. Then Zintas Rex Guard, and you guessed it, they are a Rex Guard unit, just a more fancy variant. They're armoured, shielded, anti-infantry. They have Vanguard deployment, which is their big selling point, and compared to regular Rex Guard, they're just slightly improved in the stats. They are non-armor piercing as well, so very much the same as the regular Rex Guard. If you're into your Vanguard deployment moves, this could be a good one for you. Now the Royal Altdorf Grifites. These are a demi-Grif unit, the same as the halberd variety, as they are anti-large. They do also cause terror, which is something the other demi-Grifs don't do, but for the most part they're very similar to the regular ones, just slightly improved in stats as always. Their weapon strength and weapon damage, armor piercing and anti-large is very much the same, but if you want a little bit of extra power and your anti-large abilities, this is going to be a good unit. Then for artillery we have the Hammer of the Witches, which is a great cannon. Very similar to the regular Great Cannon, it has slightly better missile damage, and its big thing is that it's magical damage. So it's going to be a good one for taking out all those ethereal units that the vampires have. Also good for some of the new artillery that they have, the new Mortis Engine and things like that. But for the most part it's very similar and is going to do a good amount of damage, even to non-ethereal units. Now the Sunmaker, which is a Hellstorm rocket battery variation. Of course, similar to the regular one, except it has fire damage. So those regenerating units need to beware of this one. And it also has a considerable amount more damage than the regular one though. And you can see 283 more damage than the regular one. Now that sounds like a lot, and it is a lot to be fair. But the thing is, you have to look at the reload time. That's where the difference is really made. So the reload time on the regular Hellstorm rocket battery is 15 seconds. Okay, not a bad time for an artillery, a general time. But on the new Sunmaker Hellstorm rocket battery, it's significantly more at 24 seconds. That's 9 extra seconds roughly it's going to take for you to reload. And that's going to really lower the damage output. So that's something to think about when you're taking this. Don't always think that that bigger amount of damage is always going to be better.
More protect us from this heresy!
Then we have the Tempelhof Luminox, and to be honest, I can't really see any difference between this and the regular one other than the couple of extra spells. So it can cast Net of Amantok and it has Encourage. It has a few stat increases that are basically pointless on it though, so unless there's something I'm missing, I don't really see too much of a difference between these two Luminox, especially not for the extra nearly 300 that you're paying for it. Vampires now, we'll start with the Lords. Helmand Gorst, who is a wizard who has regeneration, first of all. He has very low armor though, so you're going to want to avoid any contact with other general because they'll probably kick his fucking head off. He can ride a corpse cart as his mount, which is pretty cool, a little bit different. But his stats otherwise are very much that of a typical wizard. I'll go through the spells quickly, you can pause the video if you want to have a good look at what they can do. There are some slightly different ones though from the typical spellbook. One of the main ones being that you can raise a unit of Grave Guard with this Awaken from the Grave spell, which is pretty damn awesome I think. Having a great unit like the Grave Guard popping out the ground, that's only going to terrify people. Then your nearest thing to a melee general you're going to get, Vlad von Karstein. He's a melee expert and he is a spellcaster as well. so he can do a bit of both. He does have a lot of health as well. If you compare him to von Carstein, he has a hell of a lot more health than von Carstein, who is obviously the best general before this update. And stat-wise, fairly typical. Got a good amount of armor, a good amount of weapon strength. Non-armor piercing though. Bit of a charge bonus on him. Great melee attack. Here's a quick look at all his abilities and some of his spells. He can't use a mount though. That's one thing he doesn't have, so he has to be on foot all the time. No mounts for him, not even a horse. And seems to have all the typical spells of his spellbook, as far as I can tell. Strigoi the Ghoul King is our next general. He's a caster who can ride a Terrorgeist, which is a pretty dangerous thing straight off the bat. No pun intended. He does suffer from low armor's disease because he only has 15 armor, so much like the other general, he will get his fucking head kicked off if he gets into melee combat with any tough generals. So you have to be careful with him. He does have poison attacks though, which is a cool feature for a general, something a bit different. His main attacks are armor piercing as well. He does have quite a lot of weapon strength, so he can go into melee fights, but it could be risky. You're definitely going to want to try and support him with a good unit so that his low armor doesn't take him down too much. Has all the typical spells and abilities. I believe he has the Death spellbook, so he has Spirit Leech and things like that. He also has a pretty cool spell where you can raise a unit of Crypt Ghouls, so lots of different units to raise now with your Grave Guards and your Crypt Ghouls. You also got the zombies, of course, so interesting stuff and different ways to play with your generals. Now for the first infantry unit, if you can call them that. The Tith are a zombie unit who are all but the same really as the regular zombie unit. They got a little bit more health and a little bit more melee attack and melee defense, so they may actually be able to do a little bit of damage to units now, but really nothing special. And for 250 I suppose it's not bad, but yeah, cheapy crappy zombie units if that's your bag. Now the Stein Stalkers, who are a skeleton warrior unit who have poison attacks, which is pretty cool. So they're going to be a great support unit. They've got quite a lot of armor as well, which is what skeleton warriors generally don't have. They're shielded too. The poison attack is going to be great for bringing down the enemy stats, of course, and helping out your other units. Compared to the regular skeletons, they're a little bit better in a few places, but for the most part, that poison is their big selling point, and the high armor actually is a good selling point for them. A Crypt Ghoul variation now with the Feasters in the Dark, which is kind of a cool name, bit weird, but kind of cool. Very similar to the regular Crypt Ghouls. Got the poison attacks. They do have Stalk, so they can move across land undetected, so it could be a pretty rad ambushing unit. Really though, their stats are only the thing that really changes too much, so just kind of a higher end Crypt Ghoul. Now for the Sternsmen, who are a Graveguard unit, this one's pretty cool. They've got the typical stuff that Graveguard have, but they have regeneration, which is a pretty big thing for them, and they have a charge defense against all, so they're not going to take any charge damage from anyone. That's a pretty big thing and is pretty damn awesome. So this is going to be a pretty tough unit. They've got better stats than the regular Graveguard, of course. They do have a silver shield, and while they are non-armor piercing, they do have a bonus versus infantry, so against other infantry units they're really going to kill it with a little bit of extra damage they can do from the BVI. Beric's Reavers are a Black Knight Lance unit. Of course they're built off that unit with slightly increased stats, and they do have regeneration as well, so that's a pretty cool feature for a cavalry to have. But for the most part they're just a fancier Black Knight with lances. Then we have a Hexwraith variation in the Chillgeists, who are very similar to the Hexwraiths, of course. They cause terror, they have Vanguard deployment, they're ethereal, they have magical attacks, and they do have armor piercing as well. The regular Hexwraiths though had fire damage on their attacks, so that is one slight difference. But the biggest thing about them, other than having a few extra stats, is that the Chillgeists have a couple of extra abilities that make them just a little bit different from the regular Hexwraiths. So the first ability they have reduces the speed of enemy units by 36%, so that's a pretty big amount. So chasing down cavalries is going to be a hell of a lot easier with this lot if you can get them in range of enemy cavalries. So that's a pretty cool feature first of all. And the other ability is a magic resistance of 25, which is something the Hexwraiths don't have. So this unit could be really great for slowing down those really fast cavalries that are hard to catch, especially like Beastmen cavalries. You can slow them down, you can get hold of them, and you can deal with them that way. So a potentially really cool unit to use there. Now for the Dire Pack unit, who are basically the same as the Dire Wolves, however they have a crowning difference of being anti-large. I think this is a really cool idea. They're going to be great for supporting your cavalries, maybe flanking around and hitting the enemy cavalry while they're engaged with other units, or simply just chasing down other cavalries. They may suffer in melee against these cavalries, I don't know if they're one-on-one, but supporting unit, they're going to be fantastic. The Devils of Schwarzhafen are a Vargeist unit. Very similar to the regular Vargeists, of course, slight increase in the stats. The main thing being that they have Vanguard deployment, so you can hide them behind the enemy lines, maybe behind the enemy army right at the start. Look for any lone skirmisher or artillery units that have been left apart from the rest of the army. You could take advantage of them, and they can also cause terror. So a higher end Vargeist unit there, going to be very similar use to the regular ones though. Now for a new unit in the Corpse Cart, which is a magic chariot, has regeneration and a magical aura, so it's going to affect the enemies and allies around you. Now the thing about magic chariots is they're not designed to be charged in. They have no charge bonus, they don't have great melee defense, they don't have great attack or anything like that. So they're really designed to kind of just sit near units and help buff them in that way. They're not really designed for direct combat so much. But it is very cheap, so if you use it to buff some of your cheaper crapper units, then it might be a good move. Then there's a Balefire version of the Corpse Cart, which is all but the same except it has magic disruption, which increases the chance of enemy wizards miscasting. So this is going to be a great tool against people who are trying to general snipe you and stuff like that with certain spells. Could be really useful, but again, very similar to the Corpse Cart. Not really a melee thing, more of a support thing. And then there's another Corpse Cart, the Unholy Lodestone version, which has mass regeneration. As you can see, regenerates the health of friendly units. This is a pretty awesome one, so keep this thing nearby your main army and it's just going to keep regenerating their health, I imagine to a limit, but really useful in the long run. Now for the Mortis Engine, which is a magic chariot that has mass regeneration, magic harvester, which increases your magic pool a bit, it can cause terror, and it has a magical aura. Now this magic chariot can actually go into melee combat somewhat. They have pretty high weapon strength. They do have quite low melee defense though, so they're going to take a fair bit of damage. I mean, it's hard not to when you're a massive freaking chariot. Melee attack's pretty good though. Not a lot of a charge bonus, but with all these buffs that it can do, it's going to be a pretty dangerous unit to have around. It also damages nearby enemy units, so just a horrible thing to have to try and fight. And finally, there is the Claw of Nagesh, which seems to be pretty much exactly the same as the Mortis Engine, but like the Luminox, it just has some slightly different abilities. This one has the chill ability, like the Chillgeist had, and some magic resistance, but for the most part, pretty much the same deal. That ability to slow down enemy speed though could be really useful against faster factions like the Beastmen, or just factions with certain faster units. So there you go, a bit of an overview of all the units in the Grim and the Grave DLC. Maybe this has helped you decide if you want to buy it. In my personal opinion, I think it's a pretty good DLC. You get some interesting units. There's a lot more tactical options there for these two factions. The only issue I have with the DLC is the two factions that they've chosen to buff. The Empire and the Vampires were probably the two factions that were least in need of a buff. When you've got factions like the Dwarves and the Chaos Warriors who are kind of struggling factions at the moment, these two strong factions just becoming even stronger could be a little bit of a balance issue, but for the most part, a generally good DLC. I assume they're going to buff the rest of the factions as well. We're obviously all still waiting to see what happens with Bretonia too. Who the fuck knows what they're doing? But yeah, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the future.